Sunday, we are going to be reading from Matthew 18, verses 15 through 20. You can follow along if you would like on your devices or your physical Bible, or you can just listen. If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you're not listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly, I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly, I tell you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. The word of the Lord. Some of you know this about me, but I'm not a big fan of cooking. It's not my favorite thing to do, but I do enjoy cooking when I have a good, reliable recipe. I'm really good at following rules. Not everybody is like this. I know that because I'm married to someone. Bud kind of has a recipe, but he's like always adding his own flair and his own ideas. And I'm like, why do you have a recipe at all if you're just going to not even follow it? But for me, the recipe is really soothing. Like we get HelloFresh sometimes, and I'm like, yes, a recipe. I will happily cook tonight because it's right in front of me. I don't even have to decide what it is. But there are no surprises. You follow the rules, and the end product is a yummy meal most of the time, assuming that mistakes don't happen. But there's such comfort in that for me, right? You follow the rules, you follow the recipe, yummy meal. Excellent. I love it. I have historically approached Scripture in this same way. You read the Scripture, you follow the rules, happy life with no conflict. Follow the rules, happy life with no conflict. But life happens, and you discover that that is actually not the case. The more that I study Scripture, the more I realize that the Bible isn't actually a rule book at all. And not only that, but it actually doesn't even promise the formula that I thought that it would promise. It does not follow the rules and a happy and conflict-free life. None of that happens when we read Scripture. But when I read this passage, I get really excited because I'm like, maybe there's a script. Maybe there's a recipe for us to follow in which we can like have a good life based on this formula given to us by Jesus right there. Everything will work out and be fine. Because when you read this text, it feels like good and logical advice. If someone hurts you, go to that person. Talk to them. If they don't hear you, bring along some witnesses. Get a mediator. Try and talk it out there. It seems like logical advice until we play it out in the actual real world. A world where it's easier to talk to someone else about someone who's hurt me. A world where there's an unbalanced power dynamic at play in a lot of cases. A world where churches can care more about their organizational structure and keeping that intact than they do about the people who are being harmed. That is actually the reality that we live in. So while this seems like really good conflict resolution strategies that we should all have a HR binder for, and there's the win-lose, compromise, win-win-win situation, it doesn't always work. And it's not without its problems. Especially if we want to try and read it as like hard and fast rules. These are the steps, and every time the outcome will be good and happy life with no conflict. When we don't make room for individual situations, when we don't make room for all of the factors that play into conflicts that rise up in our lives. And I'm going to be honest with you guys, while I really like reading this passage and thinking, yep, this is how we should do it, I'm not good at it. I'm actually pretty bad at it. I'm terrified to tell someone directly if they've hurt me. Not only because I'm afraid of what their response might be, but I'm also terrified to admit to someone else that I actually have the ability to have hurt feelings, or feelings at all. I'm putting myself out there, and it's too vulnerable, it's too raw, and I don't like doing it. Vulnerable situations are just like, no, thank you. And sometimes the safest thing is not to talk to someone directly. There are so many reasons why confronting your offender could put you in further harm. Sometimes the best course of action is to go to someone else who you trust first. These rules don't always apply. But on the whole, this passage does give us some good advice in ways to be the church. In fact, the word church, Ekklesia, is used one of only 2 times in the whole of Matthew's gospel, and it's used right here in this passage. Ekklesia, the church, is named. For those of you who may not know why we chose Ekklesia as our name, it literally means the called out ones. And in Greek society, it was a group of people who were called out from their homes to gather in an assembly in the city and go about the business of the city to make decisions for the best, for the betterment of the city. And the followers of Jesus, knowing this word and what it was used for, reclaimed it, reused it, and began to speak of the community of Christ's followers as the called out ones. These were the people called out to go about the business of God's kingdom in the cities where they lived. We, Ekklesia, continue that tradition. We're the called out ones, trying to embody God's kingdom, working toward reconciliation amongst ourselves and in our city as best we can. And God knows we don't do this perfectly. But I believe that we're moving in a good direction. So much of the conversations that we've been having over these past months have pointed towards this different way forward, this way of honoring each other, this direction towards growth and reconciliation. There's something about this passage that's actually worth us digging into as the ones called out. I have said I really dislike conflict, and there's no way to avoid it. In fact, Jesus knew there would be conflict, hence the instructions. The reality is that there has already been conflict among the 12 disciples. This joke that I always love is the biggest miracle about Jesus is that he was able to maintain a group of 12 friends in his 30s. Somehow they were able to keep it together for at least a year of ministry. But they were not without their conflicts. In fact, right before this passage, they're arguing about who's the greatest in God's kingdom. And later, James and John's mother is going to go to Jesus and advocate for her sons to sit on Jesus' right and left when he comes into his kingdom. And if that isn't some hot tea, I don't know what is. But rather than pretend that everyone is fine or pretend that people aren't talking about what James and John's mother is about to go do, Jesus offers a way forward to deal with the conflict. And while I could maybe take some time to take each step and unpack it and think like, how that might play out, I think it's actually more important to highlight what these instructions are pointing toward. What is the heart of what Jesus is saying here? Jesus is offering the disciples a way forward to honor and respect each other, a way to see and treat each other with dignity. Here's what I mean by that. When we're going to other people rather than people who have hurt us directly, it's called triangulation. I don't know how many of you guys know or experienced that. In my time in leadership, I have been both the giver and the receiver of triangulation. I am both guilty and have been harmed by it. Because I know that it's easier to talk to someone else about your hurt feelings than to go directly to the person who offended you. But if we really think about what that's doing to the person who's offended us. It's objectifying them. It's devaluing their humanity. It's making them an object. It's saying you are nothing but the offense that you did against me, rather than seeing them for all of their complexity as fellow human beings, as complex as I am of a human being, with different experiences, different narratives, different perspectives, different ways of being. As members of a community, we have chosen, to some degree, to belong to one another. We've made a kind of commitment to one another to be in community. So when we think about this way of triangulating, of talking about someone without them present, it's a type of objectification that looses toxicity and binds bitterness and anger in a community. I have seen it happen. And though we may not want to confront our offender because it's scary and vulnerable, as I mentioned above, honoring their dignity as someone worthy of our honesty can be the act that regains them, that wins them over. And when we're speaking directly to our offender, we're loosing a balm of reconciliation and binding grace and forgiveness in the community. At the heart of these instructions from Jesus is that the community will grow and transform alongside one another. Remember, I talked about a couple of weeks in Romans 12 about hope for a type of community that can work, in which we're being transformed by one another while we're allowing one another to minister to one another. This passage in Matthew reflects that same hope and that same refrain. It can work. Jesus is outlining a community who speaks truth to one another, who makes space for conflict, for the inevitability that we will disagree on something, that we might even hurt each other, but that if we choose it, we can also grow and learn from one another. It can work. We can allow ourselves to be transformed by one another. That is, in fact, what being a community is all about. But our culture doesn't really value or understand community, I don't think. We don't understand that our flourishing is bound up with one another. We're all about rugged individualism and pulling our own selves up by our own bootstraps, and I'm fine alone, and I can just live on an island with no one else around me and I'll be happy. And that narrative of individualism leads to a circle of isolation. We find a like-minded community, we think everything is great, we encounter conflict, then someone hurts or offends us. Instead of speaking honestly with gentleness towards the offender, we get angry, we get bitter, we let it fester, we leave to find a community where we're more like-minded. But we find conflict there too, so we keep searching until we've spun ourselves into isolation where we can only find comfort behind the echo chamber of our carefully curated screens. Now, please don't misunderstand me when I say these things. There is absolutely 100% times in which we need to leave toxic communities and toxic environments that are truly unsafe for us, places where we should not be forced to stay. And I think as long as folks in the community are willing to listen to one another, are willing to hear truth when it's spoken, even when the truth is difficult to hear or when it requires something from us, that is a community worth staying in. Because when we engage one another from the perspective that when two or more are gathered and Christ is present with us, then what we are saying is that we are walking into conflict with a heart for reconciliation, knowing that Christ's presence is with us. And my God, how much does our world need this? There's so much division. There's so much isolation. There's so much fear. But maybe we can be representatives of a different way. A way where we're curious about our differing perspectives rather than threatened by them. Where we're humble enough to realize that we might actually be wrong. Where we take responsibility for the harm that we've caused to one another. Where we give and receive great forgiveness and grace freely. That's what Jesus is describing in this passage. That is God's kingdom. And if I'm honest, it's the type of community that I want to be a part of. It's my hope for the community that we're attempting to build here. I know that there will be hiccups. I know that I will mess up, and I know that I already have in so many ways. And in this community of people, I've seen glimpses of it. And when I see it, it gives me hope. The ways that we are allowing ourselves to be transformed by one another can be uncomfortable. But there's also something really magical, and dare I say it, holy, when a community works towards reconciliation, where we choose to honor the dignity, the imago Dei, the image of God that resides in each of us. See, in this passage, it talks about what's bound on earth is bound in heaven, and what's loosed on earth is loosed in heaven. And I'm like, what does that have to do with what Jesus just said about how to work out conflict? And maybe I don't know all of the nuances of that, but what I think might be said here, what I would like to suggest is that if we believe that the divine, resides within each of us, and that the presence of God resides in the space between us, then when we loose toxins, bitterness, anger, unforgiveness, and resentment within our own selves, we're loosing that in the space between where God dwells. Or we can choose, as much as we are able, to loose grace and honesty and forgiveness into our communities. And by loosing that, we are loosing it in the space between, in the space where God dwells. If we think of heaven as the space that God resides, in the place that God dwells. There is something at work. The divine is at work in those spaces in between. By loosing reconciliation, we're transformed. We are transformed. And the divine space between us shines brighter. Because when 2 or 3 are gathered, truly, Christ is among us.